In the early hours of the 24th of November 2016, a man was waved down by a frantic woman on the side of the highway. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and she was wrapped up in a chain around her waist. She was screaming for an ambulance. The story I'm about to tell you sounds like the plot of a movie, but unfortunately, every part of it is true. Hi, my name's Yasmin and I make videos about topics that are scary, disturbing, or true crime, so if you'd like to, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and we'll get on with the rest of this story. Sherri was born on the 11th of June 1982 in Shasta County, California, and she grew up in an area called Redding, California. By 2006, she married a man named David Dreyfus, who was serving the military at the time, but their marriage really didn't last too long. They sort of just grew apart and ended up getting a divorce very soon after getting married in the first place. Once they separated though, Sherri moved on very quickly. She reconnected with somebody named Keith Papini, who just happened to be her first kiss back in 7th grade. Keith and Sherri went out just on a few dates, and by the third date they were completely inseparable. They had this intense connection that neither of them had felt before, and the time that Sherri and Keith spent together was just filled with pure laughter and joy. The pair did end up getting married in 2012, and Sherri described them as being best friends, or just like a perfect couple in general. Sherri and Keith were living in a home that was situated pretty out of the way. It was quite rural in an area called Mount Gate, California, and a couple of years into their marriage they welcomed their son Tyler. 2 years after that, they welcomed the arrival of their daughter Violet, and Sherri from this point on was a devoted stay-at-home mum. The people in her community, and her own sister in fact, really looked up to her and described her as a super mum, which is why the events that follow are so weird and out of character for somebody like Sherri. There really is no viable explanation for it, and you'll soon know what I mean. On the 2nd of November 2016, the day started off just like any weekday. Keith worked full-time at Best Buy, so he'd wake up early in the morning, do his morning routine, and he'd get ready for work, and then he'd kiss Sherri goodbye and just set off for the day. Meanwhile, Sherri would also get up early and she'd get the kids ready for daycare, but since Sherri was a stay-at-home mum, it was her responsibility to drop the kids off at daycare and pick them up at the end of the day. On this particular day, Keith got home at around 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and when he opened the front door, he saw that the house was just completely empty. There was no signs of kids running around, no one came to say hello to him, his wife was nowhere in sight. He thought maybe they'd gone out somewhere, so he tried to call Sherri's cell phone, but there was no answer whatsoever. Instead, he called the daycare center and asked them when the kids were picked up, but the daycare worker said that the kids actually haven't been picked up yet. They were still there. As soon as he heard that, Keith's heart just sunk. He had this sick feeling in his stomach that something has happened to Sherri. Sherri would always pick the kids up at around 4:30. She'd never forgotten in the past, so he knew that something out of the ordinary must have been going on for this to happen. He called his mum to pick up the kids while he searched for Sherri because this was completely out of character for her. But before jumping to any conclusions, he did think maybe she had gone out for a run or a jog, because recently she'd been doing a lot of training and a lot of running around their neighborhood, so maybe she just lost track of time. Before jumping to any conclusions though, he thought maybe she'd gone out for a run. Recently she'd been doing a lot of training, so she'd run laps around their neighborhood. But again, this was very unusual for her because she would have known what time it was and she would have definitely picked up the kids. She wouldn't have just gone out for a run and just not checked anything. He called again, but there was just no answer. So this time he connected to that Find My Phone app, and he could see Sherri's phone was located only about a mile away from their house. Keith also noticed that her location was completely stationary the whole time, so he drove over to where Sherri's phone was, but there was no sign of Sherri. Her phone was located on the grass with the white headphones still in the power jack, and just strands of her blonde hair was intertwined in the headphones. Keith took some photos of what the phone looked like on the ground and called 911. On the phone with the 911 dispatcher, he was absolutely frantic, saying that somebody took his wife and that the only thing that she had left behind was her phone, and this was on a patch of grass on the side of the road. Someone had clearly kidnapped Sherri, and the police's prime suspect was, of course, Keith. Just because in cases like this, most of the time the husband or the spouse is most likely to have had something to do with it. But Keith genuinely didn't care that he was a suspect at all. He just wanted to find his wife alive. He even had a hard time explaining it to the kids, where he waited a couple of days, but he really couldn't put it off for any longer. Whoever kidnapped Sherri absolutely shattered this family. Keith even did a polygraph test to prove he wasn't lying about not knowing where Sherri was, although polygraph tests aren't really that accurate. He still passed, so that was a good look for him. Keith was seriously getting upset with how police were handling the situation. He just thought they were not doing enough, not quick enough anyway. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. He'd go on live TV, visibly upset, and speak to journalists, and he'd be begging for the captors to release his wife. This incident really shook up the community because now there was potentially an unknown person kidnapping young women off the streets. It really affected these people's lives, and families wouldn't let their daughters go out on their own on the street anymore, when in reality something like this had never really happened in the area before. The whole community got involved with the search for Sherri. Missing person posters were plastered all over town with a big photo of Sherri's face. A GoFundMe campaign was even opened up, and it raised $49,000 to help with search efforts to find Sherri Papini. And this is pretty crazy because that happened within 3 weeks. In the early hours of the 24th of November, police received a call from someone on a highway in Yolo County saying that he was waved down by a woman who was on the side of the road who appeared to be in extremely terrible shape. She was still chained up around the waist and she was begging for an ambulance. This, in fact, was Sherri Papini. She was taken straight to hospital where her husband and her were finally reunited after 3 weeks. After 3 weeks of not knowing what the future was going to hold for Keith, he was so relieved to finally have Sherri sitting in front of him alive. Sherri wasn't in good shape though. She was covered in cuts and bruises and burns all over her body, literally from head to toe. Her hair was cut super messy and really short. She had these ligature marks on her wrists and ankles from being tied up. And probably the most disturbing of them all was the fact that she was branded on her right shoulder blade. This is what Sherri said happened on the day that she was taken. She went out for a jog in the middle of the day in the general vicinity of her home when she was all of a sudden attacked by 2 Hispanic women. These women had their faces half covered with a cloth, and they held Sherri at gunpoint, telling her that she had to get into this black van. They put a bag over her head and they wrapped a chain around her waist. This chain they anchored to something within the van so that Sherri couldn't actually get away. Then they drove somewhere for 2 hours, and Sherri didn't know about anything that was going on because the women were only speaking Spanish to each other. Once they got to their location, Sherri said that the bag was still over her head and she was taken into a room to be chained up to a wall there. She was isolated in this room and the bag was finally removed. The Hispanic woman always had their faces covered so she could not really identify them when people asked her about who these women were or what they looked like. Sherri also said that she had no access to a toilet. She had to use kitty litter that was on the floor. and she did this for about almost 3 weeks. During this time, she was badly beaten and abused, and she even got branded. And the reason why she got branded is because apparently she got taken as part of a sex trafficking ring, and this branding was basically saying who she belonged to now. But 22 days later, they decided to let her go, offering no explanation as to why. All they did was they put that bag over her head again and drove onto the highway and just ditched her on the highway in the middle of the night, well, early hours of the morning. In the hospital, the police took the clothes that Sherri was found in so that they could do some DNA analysis, and in the meantime, they were frantically searching for these 2 Hispanic women. But as I said, Sherri really didn't give them much to go off. I mean, she said their faces were covered half the time, so she couldn't even give a description of what they looked like accurately. The DNA analysis results were so confusing because the only DNA that was found on her clothes was male DNA, which didn't match to anybody in the police database. So again, police were at a loss as to which direction to take in this case. But in 2020, there was a break in the case, and this is what police had been waiting for. They finally found a match to the DNA that was found on Sherri's clothes, and it seemed to belong to an ex-boyfriend of hers, and he lived in Costa Mesa in Southern California. Police got in contact with him and they interviewed him, which is where he spilt all the beans about everything that had happened. Turns out, Sherri was not abducted by 2 random Hispanic women like she had been claiming for years. She started texting her ex-boyfriend James Reyes in secret using prepaid phones about a year before her suspicious disappearance. James said that he picked Sherri up that day and she basically came back home to his house where she was voluntarily chilling at his house for almost 3 weeks. She was the one who inflicted all those wounds and bruises on her body, and she initially even asked James to punch her in the face, to which he refused, of course. So she went off and banged her head repetitively on the bathtub and on all the tiles and the floors, just so she could cause those injuries to herself. In terms of the branding, she did get James to help out with this, but it was entirely her idea. So police now had this goldmine of information, but they had to get Sherri to somehow admit it. By the time she admitted it, she'd been lying for 6 years. She'd been living with her family, she'd been living with Keith, she'd been around her children, just living a normal-ish life, still saying that Hispanic people took her for 6 years. In an interrogation in 2022, with police officers and Keith in the room, they finally got a successful confession out of Sherri, where she admitted to this whole abduction thing being a scam and that she disrupted the entire community and wasted police resources all for nothing. Not only that, but she put Keith through hell and their kids. Imagine how much her kids missed their mum and thought that they would never see her again. She'd never be coming back home again. Up until this point, her husband stood by her side. He felt sorry for her. He loved her for all the years, and he had to deal with her going through the supposed PTSD and the anxiety that was all caused by the abduction. Once she admitted her lies, though, that was it. He filed for divorce and he claimed sole custody of the children. Fair enough. Sherri was sentenced to 19 months in prison for lying to a federal officer and mail fraud. So mail fraud because she claimed money from the government as a victim. She was entitled to some support for mental health consultations. She actually ended up claiming $128,000 of disability payments, plus she had the $49,000 from the GoFundMe campaign. Although this whole story sounds a bit shocking to us, some people in Sherri's life were really not that shocked by it. For example, one of her ex-boyfriends from when she was in her early 20s, he was 15 when they were dating, which is kind of weird, claimed that she was a compulsive liar. Her own father also said that in 2003 she tried to burglarize his home, and on a separate occasion she stole money from a bank account that was owned by him, but eventually she did pay him back for it. So why did she do it? No one actually knows. In fact, she doesn't even know why she did it. It's clear that she seems to regret her actions, but what on earth would push someone to do this to their family? There was no evidence of any domestic violence or any household problems. As she said herself, her marriage was perfect. Forensic psychologists have looked into this in a little bit more detail, just to rule out whether it was caused by anxiety, bipolar, or schizophrenia, but they don't think it was, just because her behavior wasn't impulsive. She'd been planning this for a year prior. They think that it's more in line with someone who may be suffering from borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder, or it simply could have been for financial gain or even attention. That was the story of Sherri Papini and the wild circumstances that surrounded her disappearance. If you found this interesting, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next week. Bye.